Thank you all so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Father Dave, to Dr. Hildebrand, to Dr. Savage, along with my colleagues and esteemed students and guests. I've been asked to talk about real life. I've been bursting at the seams to present these ideas for a decade. And typically I find my outlet in a podcast, a little plug, it's called the Being Human podcast, if anyone's interested. But there I have unlimited time, and here I do not. So I've written my comments for today, and we'll be going quickly through some fairly dense material. I'll be happy to email anyone my notes if you'd like them afterwards. Our disposition of distrust goes back to the garden. It is the consequence of the fall, and as Cardinal Ratzinger writes, it causes us to lose access to the face of God. This is in one of the most important letters that anybody here needs to read to understand gender and our genius. It's called A Letter to Bishops of the Church on the Collaboration of Man and Woman in the Church. My suggestion is that in many ways, we are all in some ways still stuck in the same epoch of suspicion, and it is still keeping us from accessing the face of God. We have a natural tendency to psychologically interpret almost everything self-referentially. We process what we perceive, what we think, what we feel, and what we believe through the lens of, what does this mean to me? JP2 teaches us that this is subjectivity, but our subjectivity is temporarily immersed in the near constant disorientation of our concupiscence. When we think about what we see in the other, and the other is not only another person, but the other kind of person, we have twice the reason to remain suspect. But we must remember that according to JP2, human life is by its nature coeducational, and its dignity, as well as its balance, depend on every moment of history and every place of geographic longitude and latitude on who she shall be for him and he for her. Reflect on this observation with me for a minute. So many times in session, I've heard a male patient say about his wife, if she were a man, she'd understand. Or when a woman says about her husband, if he were a woman, he'd understand. By the way, when I say in session, that's really just code for things that typically happen in my own marriage and my own family life. This is a typical disposition that I am gently suggesting that we all may hold within ourselves on some level. It's an easy thought pattern to fall into, but let's look more closely at Ratzinger's teaching. He says in his letter concerning the characteristics of the feminine genius that is only because women are more immediately attuned to these values that they are the reminder and the privileged sign of such values. In the final analysis, every human being, man or woman, is destined to be for the other. In this perspective, that which is called femininity is more than simply an attribute of the female sex. The word designates indeed the fundamental human capacity to live for the other and because of the other. I receive my wife's gift of herself to me, and her femininity makes me a better man, precisely because I receive it. When we receive gifts, they become ours. When we give gifts, they become the others. If men don't become receptive in the way women are, being formed by their primary biological place in the conjugal act, that image of receptivity, then they can't be fully formed as persons through the act. Here is the telos of complementarity. And I think we miss the mark when we don't start from the end. Anything else we have to say about the differences, geniuses, characteristics, or values should all be pointing us towards this ultimate question. How does a particular reality of difference open up the possibility for each man and woman to become a better version by receiving these characteristics from the other? This giving and receiving, in practical terms, represents a movement towards naked without shame. In other words, entering even more freely into the type of relationship in which the differences of the other are not held in suspicion, not protected against, but reverenced with awe and excitement at the possibility of transformation and growth. This means that men should be excited to become more like women and spend time receiving these lessons from the women in their life. And women should be excited to become more like men and spend time receiving these lessons from the men in their life. Now, if this causes some interior discomfort to frame it like this, your discomfort might represent a latent vulnerability within our human social structure that only recently has fully emerged. The acceptance of child mutilation, or even just the allowance of furries, is abhorrent. Yet we've been building towards this for centuries. If we were really solidified in our intrinsic identity as man or woman, it would not be uncomfortable to consider how we might become more like the other. God made us different for a reason, and that reason is for us to become better versions of ourselves by receiving and incorporating that which we don't already have on our own. With that framework, we can now look at some more practical ways that this is typically difficult. For starters, we have to realize just how deep these differences go. Through a psychological lens, we can learn much more about the interior experience of man and woman. The very way a man or woman experiences the room they're sitting in is different. That's right. Look around. The person near you who is the opposite sex is having right now an entirely different experience in this room. No man will ever know what the world feels like to a woman, and no woman will ever know what it feels like to experience the world as a man. Men, through spatial awareness and cognitive processing, have a totally different sense of being in the room, while women locate themselves and navigate based on proximity to particular points and experience less of a spatial wholeness to the room. I like to think that maybe a woman's neurology is built differently because of her womb. And the capacity for bearing children, she's been given a body by God to actually become a room. So if we don't even sit in the room and feel the space around us the same way, how are we supposed to trust each other's perception of mannerisms, facial expressions, tones of voice, or remember details? Yet, we are different and built to experience almost every part of our lives with these fundamental differences. Without the why, this almost seems like a cruel joke that we're meant to coexist and even live together. When a man is driving somewhere late at night and gets lost, how is he supposed to trust the goodness of his wife's disposition that says that they should stop and ask for directions? How is she supposed to trust her husband's disposition that they don't need to? There are deep neurological patterns at work in these moments, but in times of stress, neither is particularly excited about learning how to be a better version of myself through the formation of the other. This is why marriage is a path towards sanctification. It goes through the cross and follows the path Christ has opened up to us to heaven. But like the rich young man, it means we have to be willing to give up our riches. Marriage is a vocation to holiness because men and women are called to subject one another to each other out of love, not seeking to be first with our own individual proclivities and perspectives, but instead letting ourselves receive and be formed by the other, not seeking to be served, but to serve. So when the husband turns to his wife with patience, with deep listening, to understand her perspective about stopping for directions, this is love. When the wife turns to her husband, doesn't use a lot of words, which is an act of love in itself, but acknowledges his desire to figure it out himself, this is also love. Here's another example, and we'll go deeper into the brain science with this one. What about the age-old stereotype of a man and woman missing each other when a woman is expressing a problem and the man rushes in to fix it? If you've seen the nail in the head video from YouTube from like 20 years ago, the woman has a nail sticking out of her head. She's trying to talk about her pain with her husband, and her husband is trying to tell her to take the nail out of her head. As the woman explains the pain in her head, she's looking for empathy. The man grows in frustration as he tries to convince her she needs to take the actual nail out of your forehead. Empathy, which according to the American Psychological Association is understanding a person from their frame of reference rather than one's own, or vicariously experiencing that person's feelings, perceptions, and thoughts, is a human value found in the feminine genius as a derivative of being oriented towards persons. Remember, this doesn't mean only women have empathy. It means that women have a biological proclivity towards it and are therefore a privileged sign. It also means that men are called to grow in this human value through relationships with women who represent this sign for him. We see this happening in the brain. The experience of empathy involves a relationship between two neural networks in the brain in both men and women, which are activated very differently in each. First, we talk about the mirror neuron system, the MNS, which allows a person to make one's own the perceived inner experience of another person through external observations. The second important system to understand, though, is called the temporal parietal junction, the TPJ. And this system increases anxiety when a problem is perceived, and the anxiety doesn't decrease until a solution is found. For women, when anxiety is increased, reciprocation of another person's mirror neurons helps to reduce her anxiety. This happens through facial cues, through tone of voice, and if a distressed woman hears her distress being mirrored by another person, her physiological distress decreases. When a woman's MNS is activated, her TPJ is actually suppressed, and there is no problem-solving activity observed. There's simply mirroring. Now, here's the really cruel joke part. For a man, the exact opposite happens. A man's MNS will activate his TPJ, and it suppresses his mirror neurons. So what is a man to do? When he sees the woman he loves in distress, his mirror neurons turn off. His brain is telling him to relieve his own anxiety, triggered by the realization that something's wrong by fixing a problem. This is the opposite of what a woman wants. Now, if we were animals, this would be the end of a sad breakup story. Instead, as if God knew what he was doing when he made us, we can have conversations about our inner experience and learn from each other what is going on. Through communication, we grow in communion because we start to figure out over time what each person thinks, feels, and desires. We can grow by mastering our biological impulses, reverencing them in each other, and developing real intimacy. I teach men that the fix to their problem they are trying to solve is usually empathy itself. This is typically mind-blowing for men when they first hear it. Growing sometimes is painful. When they come around, though, by surrendering their way of thinking, they let the motivation triggered by their temporal parietal junction actually turn back towards activating their mirror neurons, and they can then express real empathy. Unsurprisingly, this decreases his wife's anxiety, and they feel more connected and at peace. Any other practical problem they have to solve then will be easier, since they're working together as friends instead of at odds with each other as enemies. One important point I like to make for couples to help kind of kickstart a little goodwill and affection in the situation is that a man's TPJ is not activated at just any time he sees someone in distress. Men are biologically built to ignore other people's distress. And really, as has been noted, really other people in general, unless they pose a potential threat. For a man's TPJ to be activated, it means his mirror neuron system was activated first by a person he cares about. It turns out that men actually have faster mirror neuron response time than women when perceiving a loved one in distress. A man's MNS is activated and then deactivated by the TPJ before a woman's MNS even gets triggered in the first place. I'll ask a wife, how many of the problems of the other women in her husband's life does he try to fix? Is he offering advice about clothing choices, ways to respond to texts, or ways to fix the mother-child rupture in regard to his sister or his aunt or for his neighbor? Probably not. A man grows in virtue by learning to redirect his need to fix back to empathy. Many relationships between men and women have deeply benefited from unpacking this brain distinction in light of the common misunderstanding that the man tries to fix the problem because he just doesn't care. And while the man is learning to develop the value of empathy, the woman can develop greater patience and understanding and the knowledge that she isn't being intentionally ignored or hurt. By understanding these different biological dynamics, men learn how to better fix the problem, and women learn how to better connect. A woman's proclivity towards the characteristic of empathy can be received by a man, and he can subsequently develop his ability to feel deep empathy. This is a simple example of a man becoming a better man by receiving and integrating the feminine genius of a woman. Likewise, when women are given a frame in which it's okay to let go of other people's feelings or boundaries that make it healthier to be in relationship, they have a deep capacity to keep a healthy perspective around those proper boundaries while maintaining a connecting, concurrent sense. A female boss who has to fire somebody can ultimately be an even better boss because she's naturally attuned to doing it with compassion than the man who simply remains detached and uncaring when he has to fire someone. All right, let's look at cognition. Looking through the lens of cognitive neurophysiology, which is simply the way our brains are wired to think, we find further evidence that women are built differently than men. These differences reveal important insights to the feminine genius and its relation to motherhood, which necessitates the capacity for a close relationship around the developing baby in the womb. An overly simplified binary paradigm is that women's brains have more connection between the left and right hemisphere, and men's brains have more connection between the front and back. Carl Stern's important work, thank you, Deborah, for bringing that up, called Flight from Woman, expounds on the various characteristic manifestations of this phenomenon, as well as the importance of reverencing and elevating our appreciation of the feminine disposition. The increased connectivity between left and right hemisphere leads to greater intuition and less differentiation in awareness of the source of knowledge. Stern coins this term transrational to distinguish the female brain's cognitive system from the male's more rational system. This paradigm I particularly like as it corrects the derogatory habit of juxtaposing rational to irrational. Transrational, instead, points to an advanced system of intuition, which is at least as important, if not more important, than rational thought in certain situations. In his book, Stern quotes Edith Stein in pointing out this gift of intuition. She says, "Women's strength is the intuitive grasp of the living concrete, especially of the personal element. She has the special gift of making herself at home in the inner world of others." Comparing intuition to rational thought, he explains it is an interior knowledge, not achieved by breaking up and disassembling, but by union and incorporation. Essentially, there is so much communication happening within the brain of a woman between various inputs that it's often impossible for her to distinguish a single point of introduction of an idea. The experience is one of just knowing without knowing how one knows. This is what we call intuition. The ability to not intuit a multitude of data inputs at the same time to formulate an insight or conclusion actually makes the male brain better fit for compartmentalization, dissection, and separation. This is the hallmark of the rational dimension of cognition, and certainly represents a characteristic of the masculine genius, which again, women also learn apart from their biological proclivity. These cognitive differences can be traced back to motherhood and fatherhood, as moms need transrational intuition to know the needs of their pre-verbal, non-rationally communicating children. Men who are disposed outwards need compartmentalization and separation. Men and women can typically relate to conflict and tension around these two very different systems of thinking. The typical conflict in session, also with my wife and I, goes something like this. "You're being really stubborn. Why can't you budge on this?" "I would totally concede. If only you could just tell me how you know what you're saying is true." I don't know. I don't know how I know. I just know." Well, that argument is invalid. You're invalid. This is not a conflict about any particularly important point. It's an argument between two ways of knowing. The typical masculine way of rational thought versus the typically feminine way of intuitive thought. This is also a physiological foundation to understand the head and heart paradigm of man and woman. Again, yes, we have these biological proclivities, but we are both made to grow in the characteristics of the other. When we had our first baby, my wife knew exactly why the baby was crying, while I had to go through a 12-point checklist to figure it out. Now, 7 kids later, I'm pretty good at intuiting a baby's need without thinking too much about it. Most of us, when given the chance to let down our protective fig leaves, find so much consolation, peace, and healing in understanding the co-imagery in our respective geniuses in this light. Contrary to Western bias, it's not better nor worse to know with rational thought or transrational intuitive thought. In fact, according to Einstein, as quoted by Stern, the intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. These are simply two different ways of knowing which emerge from different sets of brain neuroanatomy. Men and women become better versions of themselves by learning from the other how to develop the manner of thinking that they are not more immediately biologically attuned to. Stern writes that human knowledge seems to have the greatest chance to arrive at truth when the two methods find a perfect balance, and that the two forms of knowledge must be harmoniously combined to form an undistorted view of reality. Here he prophetically points us towards the purpose of complementarity. And I might add, this seems to be a good way to understand the solution that John Paul II offered philosophically with his personalism to the distrust and the divide between a sort of strict kind of Thomism and phenomenology. And both need to come to understand each other in this deeper way. This is truly integrated complementarity, and my proposal for how to understand genius. While women have the proclivity and biological attunement for intuition, which makes them a privileged sign of this characteristic of being human, men learn how to be intuitive. While men have the proclivity and biological attunement for rationality, which makes them a privileged sign of this characteristic of being human, women learn how to be rational. These formative lessons in humanity begin from the moment of conception as male and female, born into a family with a mom and dad who begin the formative process. Without the influence of the complementary genius, each characteristic, in this case, the way of thinking, becomes a liability to human development. A person can be too rational without learning how to be intuitive, and a person can be too intuitive without learning how to be rational. Through mutual self-gift, men and women become better. Ratzinger alludes to the distortion of unfeminized masculinity in his letter when he says that without women, humanity would be closed in self-sufficiency, dreams of power, and drama of violence. This is what testosterone-fueled compartmentalization and distance looks like without the complementary feminine genius forming it to become more human. Likewise, St. John Paul II said that the woman must take care that her sensitivity does not succumb to the temptations to possessive selfishness, and must put it at the surface of authentic love. On these conditions, she gives of her best, everywhere adding a touch of generosity, tenderness, and a joy of life. An orientation towards others could lead to possessive selfishness, the opposite of generosity, tenderness, and joy. We can see here that what this orientation without the complementary masculine genius forming it to become more human could look like. Too much proximity without the complementary distance is a bad thing. We can now see this dynamic in the need of one another played out even more specifically in the bedroom. As has been pointed out, the male orientation to the physical and the female orientation to the emotional are real phenomena, but also need to be processed through the lens of teleological complementarity. It's not enough for husbands to simply learn that what their wives need to enjoy a pleasant, intimate experience. The old adage that foreplay for the evening begins at the dishwasher in the morning. Nor is it enough for wives to learn how deeply ingrained physical attraction is for the male brain and body. These rudimentary distinctions also leave men and women feeling like, hey, I want that other thing too. There is a sacramental genius to our intimacy. Matrimony itself is not complete until it is consummated, meaning the body ratifies what the words have vowed. The body makes visible the invisible. Two different bodies with two different set of primary needs makes visible the starting point of the primordial sacrament. Beginning there with trustful surrender and reverence for one another, each conjugal moment of interaction within the marriage provides the fertile ground for conversion and sanctification. Physical intimacy often causes emotional needs, concerns, fears, desires, and memories to surface that require deeper communication. Deeper emotional connection often leads to the desire for physical intimacy. When couples learn to see each other's natural attunement as a gift, they more fully participate in the grace that's available through the sacrament of matrimony. In the Catechism, number 1641, it talks about the grace of matrimony. By reason in their state of life, Christian spouses have their own special gifts. This grace proper to the sacrament of matrimony is intended to perfect the couple's love and to strengthen their indissoluble unity. By this grace, they help one another attain holiness in their married life and in welcoming and educating their children. And this grace is spelled out in the next paragraph, 1642. Christ gives them the strength to take up their crosses and to follow him, to rise after they have fallen, to forgive one another, to bear one another's burdens, and to be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. When married couples have sex, there is a renewal of marital vows, and a refreshment of matrimonial grace. This doesn't happen solely because of the biochemical pathways related to the conjugal act, though it doesn't not happen because of them. Testosterone, oxytocin, etc., things we've been talking about. There is a deep synergy between the masculine and feminine genius within the marital act itself, with the end being union, holiness, and happiness as persons. When men and women learn to appreciate the full reciprocity of each other to the point of actually receiving more than the body of the other in the act, they are transformed by the mind and the heart of the other as well. Man and woman are both in the position of receptivity and both in the position of gift. Thank you, Dr. Waldstein, for your comments earlier on that. When men and women don't have as their end the receptivity of the other's full gift, receptivity of grace is also limited, and it is more difficult to take up the cross, more difficult to rise after falling, more difficult to forgive one another, more difficult to bear one another's burdens. These are the things that show up in marital therapy every day, and more difficult to be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. This is the rotten fruit of remaining separate from and suspicious, leery, or tired of the other's emotional or physical primary attunement and the loss of access to God's face that Ratzinger pointed us to. But we've gotten to one of these extreme inflection points in history where ideas are manifesting in the most obvious of real life. 10 years ago, parents wanted me to talk about how they can 10 years ago, parents wanted me to present on what to do with cell phones. Today, they totally bypass their kids and want me to talk about how they can manage their own distress. One possibility for this is that the kids are so far beyond perceivable help that parents aren't even asking how anymore. From where I sit, COVID amplified whatever crisis was brewing, and now all the alarms should be going off. We need an action plan quickly. Even though we're talking about sex and gender here, comments have already been made pointing to the next wave of chaos of transhumanism. What I see in various degrees across the spectrum is people who are losing a grip on what it means to be human. As JP2 reminded us over and over again, everything comes down to what it means to be a person. And as he also pointed out in various ways, that being a person means being in relationship. Philosophical nuances aside, in real life, relationship is not accidental. When babies are removed from other humans after they're born, they die. The unity of life within a person cannot be preserved without relationship. Relationships are like oxygen for the human person, and we've been slowly asphyxiated since 2012. We can see this in kids, and I hear about this every week. 10 years ago, the concerns about screen time developed into 8 years ago, concerns about anxiety and depression. Then COVID, people woke up to the dangers of social isolation. We had a brief reprieve and hope for a return to some kind of normal, but it quickly became clear that the situation is far worse than it was before. Anxiety and depression morphed into higher rates of panic disorder, self-harm, and suicidality. Now, I hear regular reports of an increase of seizure disorders in the classroom. I was just talking about this on Monday in Houston at a conference for Catholic educators, and Sister Johanna was there. And she let me know the next day when she got back, 3 students that day had seizure disorders. Our kids are so detached from their repressed psychological distress that some of them can't even feel it anymore psychologically. They're instead expressing symptoms with pure somatization. They are becoming lost in a sea of non-humanity. Meanwhile, they're listening to and absorbing ideas that are so distorted and untethered that they're not being led back to humanity. And honestly, even in Catholic context, there are pop influencers introducing these ideas based on their own personal interpretations, or saying things kind of flippantly without realizing the gravity of their level of influence. I grew up with media influencers ranging from Howard Stern to Rush Limbaugh. And people had their favorites, but our families, our neighborhoods, provided the normalizing buffer to maintain common ground so that we could all get along with each other. Without that buffer, a single podcast episode has the power to disrupt entire communities. So I want to end on a note of hope. JP2 reminds us that love is the answer to the problem of human existence. It's the only force that can unite individuals and nations and transform society. The hope is that the choice to love is already ours. We are the solution to the problem in every act of self-surrendering love. Thank you.
Well, let me start by expressing my belief that the subject of this conference, I think, is possibly the most significant challenge we're facing as a culture, as a church. So I'm honored to be a part of the conversation. Deborah, thank you for having me. So I think about the impact of the psychotherapist's moral worldview as coming from two separate but overlapping sources. First, there's the personal worldview of the therapist, and then there are the moral assumptions embedded in the clinical approach or approaches she uses with her clients. And it's important to know that not all therapists are aware of the latter, but the impact of these two sources of worldview on the practice of psychotherapy remains regardless of sort of the widespread edict within the field that a therapist should always bracket their moral values. Why is this edict problematic? Well, it's kind of simple. When people struggle to find happiness in their lives or in their marriages and they go knock on the door of a counselor, the matter of what flourishing is comes bubbling up to the surface really fast. And the definition of flourishing depends on one's moral worldview, one's view of who we are, where we came from, why we're here, where we're going. And when it comes to anthropology, there's no value-neutral way of doing therapy against which every other approach might be judged as imposing values on the client. In her book, Bad Therapy, Abigail Schreier details quite convincingly, I think, the ways in which a particular kind of worldview has come to dominate our field and cause great harm to children in particular over decades. Her book poses the weighty question of what is harm in a field that's meant to help people avoid harm and find flourishing. And the answer to this question, again, depends on one's moral worldview. But the worldview problem doesn't stop with a therapeutic treatment of children. Marital counseling is not immune from the influence of either the therapist's worldview or the philosophical grounding of the approach she employs. How the therapist sees a couple who sits down in front of her, beleaguered and distressed, usually considering divorce as a final option, is of great importance. And I think in some ways, marriage counseling provides a frontline view of the impact of anthropology on the real lives of men and women. And so that's what I want to make my focus today. And I'll do this by describing my experience of a clinical approach for couples that I have found to be very effective in my practice. It's called emotionally focused therapy, or EFT. EFT was developed in the 80s by a really gifted British psychologist named Sue Johnson, who actually passed away this year, and a Canadian psychologist named Les Greenberg. The model is based on the attachment theory of John Bowlby, but is also heavily influenced by the philosophical premises, some philosophical premises, which unfortunately, and for reasons I'm going to describe, have left the model vulnerable to what I've come to think of as hijacking by activists in my field, in EFT in particular, in a way that really doesn't lead to flourishing, but is only causing more confusion. But let me back up and describe for you the beauty in the practice of the model of EFT. How is it useful for the Catholic marriage therapist? And I'll start with a confession. When I first began to practice psychotherapy, I was absolutely terrified of working with couples. And this was in part because other therapists had shared with me how very difficult it was, and also because I knew that my graduate level training in it was pretty minimal. But my residency supervisor, shout out to Guy Strouder, was thankfully a highly skilled and enthusiastic marriage counselor. And he started to bring me into his sessions, first just to watch, and then slowly to sort of try out my own clinical interventions. But I soon began to wrestle with the inevitable. What is this going to look like when he's not here and I have to lead these sessions by myself? How am I going to support these couples in a way that works not only in the short term, but with lasting effects? And maybe most importantly, how do I conduct couples counseling in a way that honors God's plan and purpose for marriage and thus for men and women, even in situations where the couple themselves may not acknowledge that plan and purpose. Here you see the therapist's worldview, right? Mine, coming into play. It's safe to assume my intention to uphold the church's view of men and women in marriage while doing couples counseling is not shared by most or even many therapists. And I'm not saying that this is easy. Unfortunately, there's no manual for how to handle the hard cases. But my view of who we are as men and women, of what marriage is, matters in the therapy room. It shows up in my line of questioning, in the direction of my guidance. It shows up in the silence as my heart aches while this couple, who is so vulnerable to my influence, slowly reveals to me layers of pain, sometimes decades of pain. And I am not neutral about the outcome for the couple in front of me. Almost always, I'm rooting for them in a world that, generally speaking, couldn't care less if they found healing or divorced. And I have been amazed by the wounds that can be healed in counseling. Some of the couples I've had the privilege to help heal came into therapy having experienced really extreme departures from faithful marriage, years of serial infidelity on one or both parts, polyamory, addiction to sex, addiction to drugs. But my worldview matters. So does the couples therapist down the road from me, who holds a view of men and marriage as generally defective and dangerous. And I've taken on some of her confused and weary couples after they've been instructed by her that it would be better for everyone involved, including the kids, if they just moved on to new relationships and focused on their own happiness. Because that's what the children really need, right? Divorced parents devoted to the cause of self-actualization. But what I've learned is that good couples therapy doesn't look like therapy with an individual times two. I discovered quickly that a map, an overarching clinical approach, is called for when there are 3 of us in the session. And I tried various approaches, each of them with some positive effect, but nothing really clicked until I tried EFT. And as I began to try out this approach, it frankly felt a little frightening in its power and depth. And I say this because with other approaches, I had been focused on kind of teaching relationship skills from kind of a detached cognitive perch. But EFT feels more to me like being transported with the couple to a land of existential fears and longings. My job is to help the couple to navigate this strange landscape and perhaps counterintuitively to camp out in and explore deeply the scariest parts of it with them. The goal is that those parts would no longer be experienced as scary, but instead understood and employed as a means of strengthening their bond. So the starting point in EFT is helping the couple to identify and organize what we call the negative cycle. The therapist basically reframes the couple's distress in terms of a negative pattern of behavioral interaction, underlying emotions, and attachment needs. And by attachment needs, I'm referring to Bowlby's work. Biological needs that we humans have, every one of us, to feel safe and connected and close to each other. These needs are apparent in the tiniest infant, and they remain throughout the course of our lives. The cycle in our sessions becomes the common enemy, and learning to disrupt it becomes the spouse's shared project. And it's not hard for the Christian to think of the negative cycle as really the work of the devil, who we know is the true enemy of marriage. But let me give you an example that illustrates, I think, a dynamic I see with some frequency, and importantly for our focus today, which is imbued with sex differences. My own experience is that average differences between the sexes are often dismissed or denied in EFT trainings as sort of backward thinking or judgmental. And of course, it's important to acknowledge, as we have here already, that there are many ways in which men and women are more similar than different. But reliable differences in the patterns of ways that men and women think and feel and behave are important for many reasons. Primary among them is that when the wounds are different, the healing journeys are different. And I'll say more about that. But I want you to imagine a husband and wife of 20 years, Dan and Jane. And when they argue, Dan experiences Jane as critical and angry. And Jane experiences Dan as emotionally withdrawn when she needs him the most. Jane longs to be the center of Dan's attention and desire, to know she's valued by him. Jane's ground zero, her core essence, is relationship. This way of being she inherited from her first mother, as Deborah was describing so beautifully today. Eve's first experience of the world included not just plants and animals. Her perspective included another person, Adam. But my client, Jane, describes this persistent sense that she is emotionally too much for Dan. She worries that he'll tire of what she perceives as her neediness, and she senses that he's tuned out and uninterested in her inner life. Now, this kind of anxiety can certainly be true of a husband in a marriage, but my observation is that it's more often women who suffer in this way. Women seem more inclined to really closely monitor the emotional stability of the marriage. They need consistent verbal and physical reassurance that their husbands are prioritizing them and the marriage. Is he initiating date nights? Is he letting her know she's his person and he's deeply interested not just in her thoughts, but in her emotional world? Does she know he'll stand in the gap and offer comfort and support when she's really at her worst, that she will never be too much? Research on personality is relevant here. Trait neuroticism, one of the big 5 personality traits, is just a hypersensitivity to negative emotion like anxiety and irritability and depression. And although neuroticism in the extreme is associated with pathology, one way of thinking about it in the more normative range is that it's just a greater sensitivity to threats in one's environment. So people with elevated levels of neuroticism are more prone to feeling rejected or neglected in relationship. What's interesting is that there's consistent evidence to show that women have, on average, higher levels of trait neuroticism than men. And there are evolutionary reasons for this sensitivity to threat. We are physically smaller than men. This has been spoken of already at this conference. The costs of sex are higher for us. And we are wired in our nervous systems to be finely attuned to the dangers posed to our babies and small children. All of this evidence fits together in a way that's very consistent with what I see in my practice. Women often experience healing when they feel seen, understood, and prioritized by their husbands. In other words, when they know that they, and by extension their children, are safe. But what about Dan? Dan longs to be given the benefit of the doubt that he would never intentionally hurt Jane. But it seems to him that nothing he does, no action is good enough for her. There's this persistent felt sense in his body and spirit of failure to please her. And it's not uncommon for men in the most vulnerable moments to express this kind of core fear of being inadequate or failing in the context of the marriage when they feel like they're doing really well in other areas of their lives, like work. There's a great podcast some of you may know, and if you don't, you need to go to it when you leave. It's called Restore the Glory, hosted by 2 Catholic psychotherapists, Dr. Bob Schutz and Jake Keim. In speaking on these average differences between men and women, they describe several profound ways that men in particular are spiritually and emotionally vulnerable. First, they suggest that all men have the wound of inadequacy, that the moment men struggle with the things or people they're called to care for, they feel inadequate. What they choose to do with it is critical. Will they lock it away and pretend it's not there? In the words of Schutz and Keim, if we avoid dealing with an issue now, we sacrifice long-term benefit for short-term peace. The alternative is, and this is what I'm often really privileged to see in my sessions, when men allow themselves to acknowledge and experience the pain of inadequacy and they lay it out in front of their wife so that it can be, as we say in EFT, co-regulated, then it can be healed. Second, they speak of the importance of men knowing and remembering our sonship is critical to living the fullness of masculinity. There are many wounds that men suffer, but one of the more profound is the silence or absence of a father. And I see this too in my work. It's alarming how many men have had little to no emotional connection to their fathers, and what's more, they haven't acknowledged this to themselves, let alone to their wife. And until the wound is seen and acknowledged, it can't be healed. But back to Dan and Jane, my job is to create moments over and over again in which it's safe enough for both of them to experience their emotions alive in the session. So they come into contact with their deepest fears and longings, and these are shared between them in a way that has usually never happened before. So unlike with most other approaches to marriage counseling, we're not talking about emotion. We're doing emotion. We're bringing deep emotion online and using that vulnerability for a purpose, which is healing and bonding. In this sense, there really is an existential quality to EFT. We're working in sacred space. The beauty of the practice of EFT is why I co-founded an EFT special interest group within the Catholic Psychotherapy Association, one goal of which is to explore the matter of integration. How does the Catholic worldview of the therapist impact her practice of EFT? And here lies the important distinction between practice and theory, and here lies the problem. So the EFT model is grounded in at least 3 theoretical orientations, one of which, it seems to me, is the primary culprit in terms of that hijacking effect I referred to earlier. The first is John Bowlby's attachment theory. The second is systems theory, which very briefly just sort of views all behavior in the context of relational systems instead of in isolation. And third, and most problematic for our focus today, is the humanistic theory of Carl Rogers. And while I won't spend too much time on the first 2, let me briefly introduce John Bowlby as the founder of attachment theory, which really lies at the core of EFT. Bowlby was a 20th century British psychiatrist trained in the tradition of psychoanalysis. In his theory of attachment, he claimed that, contrary to the popular Freudian view of the time, it's not the infant's desire for oral gratification which leads to a sort of secondary drive for attachment, but instead that seeking and maintaining close contact or attachment behavior with caregivers is an innate force, the result of years of evolutionary adaptation. Bowlby's contribution here was really groundbreaking and laid the foundations for an important shift in the way we think not only about the emotional needs of children, but of adults too. But let me turn to the influence of psychologist Carl Rogers, a contemporary of Bowlby, on EFT. Rogers was a founder of humanistic psychology, a positive idea in that it was intended to be a reaction against the reductive qualities of behaviorism and psychodynamic theory. Any psychologist or psychotherapist will tell you that Rogers' place in our training is really one of unquestioned and absolute admiration. Such is his status as sort of the patriarch of empathy and understanding that to critique Rogers publicly in the sphere of mental health is really to put your reputation as a decent human being on the line. In other words, I may be unemployable after this talk, but I'll worry about that later. The reality is that the influence of Rogers' ideas it really extends deeply in the field. It goes far beyond EFT. However, I am convinced that much of the waywardness that EFT is experiencing right now is fueled by a Rogerian worldview. So in the clinical realm, Rogers is best known for his person-centered therapy, which looked to facilitate a client's self-actualizing tendency, which is defined as an inbuilt proclivity toward growth and fulfillment. So this, in theory, is accomplished through an unconditional positive regard for the client, and importantly, for all of the client's choices. But Rogers, unlike Bowlby, was very clear in his hostility toward organized religion and natural moral law. In keeping with our focus today, the importance of a sound account of man and woman, I want to emphasize those principles of Rogerian theory that most seriously undercut the Catholic and natural moral law view of marriage. In doing so, I want to emphasize, too, the role that emotion plays in his theory, for this is relevant to a discussion of a couples therapy model, which, as they say in EFT, privileges emotion. How is it problematic when the acceptance of our emotions comes at the expense of objective norms and greater human flourishing? From both a Catholic and natural law perspective, marriage has at least 2 fundamental and defining purposes, right? The first is a strengthening of the union of the spouses who are sanctified through their fidelity to the marriage and whose flourishing is safeguarded by the norms of monogamy and indissolubility. The second is procreation. Lifelong marriage of a child's parents serves to dramatically increase that child's chances of being known and loved by and knowing and loving the 2 people who brought her into the world. And we know from the work of scholars like Brad Wilcox about all the concrete ways that marriage matters in the development of the child, but also in the flourishing of society. Carl Rogers' view of marriage as primarily a loving bond, emotional bond, one distinguished by its intensity, was shaped by his conviction that universal moral norms are an impediment to human growth. Ideally, Rogers asserted, values are not held rigidly, but are constantly changing. For Rogers, it's this fluid quality of moral norms paired with man's drive toward self-actualization, which defines human flourishing. While the natural law worldview, and that of Aquinas, sees emotion as healthy and good when under the command of reason, Rogerian theory puts emotion squarely at the center of mature personhood. In discerning what's true, we look not to shared societal values, and certainly not to religious values, but to our own North Star. In fact, Rogers wrote an entire book entitled Becoming Partners, Marriage and Its Alternatives, calling for the rejection of traditional marriage in favor of a partnership revolution in which Americans explore alternatives to the nuclear family. For example, communes where sex partners are shared and exchanged. These arrangements are characterized by him as having enormous value by virtue of there being a, quote, process of living rather than a set of role expectations. In the book, he recommends passing a law to make any partnership legal so long as no one is, quote, hurt. Notice again, Rogers' view of what constitutes hurt here matters. What of the emotional and spiritual welfare of the 3 women on the commune who share a bed with one man or vice versa? What happens to the children of these various unions? For Rogers, and from a humanistic perspective, self-actualization is the goal, and flexibility, not only of emotional responsivity, but of moral values, is the pathway to it. This distinction concerning flexibility is key for our discussion of EFT, because in working with a couple, I do want flexibility of emotional response in our sessions. I want the husband and wife to sort of shift from their places of rigidity in the negative cycle to new experiences of emotional openness and vulnerability. But any psychotherapist worth her salt knows that all behaviors, all choices are not adaptive and oriented toward the good of the client. This is important because you'll often hear EFT therapists say things like, my goal is to have the flexibility to meet a client where they are. If I get anxious about an issue of sexual morality, it means I need to regulate my own nervous system. This way of using the term flexibility is often the rationale for helping to strengthen the sexual and emotional bonds of couples and thruples of varying kinds and orientations. But the way I've come to think about flexibility is this. A good psychotherapist should always approach the client from a place not just of authentic regard, but of genuine curiosity. I want the couple in front of me I want to know the couple in front of me, I want to know their story, and I want them to experience being known by me. This can mean flexibility on my part, but I should never be bound by it, because when flexibility becomes my rigid stance, it no longer has the desired effect. The couple's flourishing and avoiding harm to the couple is always the right goal. Flexibility may or may not be a means to that end. So let me conclude by returning to the idea of integrating Catholic anthropological principles with the practice of EFT. I hope I've convinced you that EFT is a solid method for strengthening and healing marriage, but that its theoretical foundations leave it open to misuse. So it seems appropriate then for the Christian psychotherapist to ground her training in the practical application of EFT in a theory of human emotion and attachment that is anthropologically sound. And as it happens, there is such a theory. There's a theory of human love and attachment that's grounded in Catholic anthropology. And I will be candid, I just learned about it fairly recently, which is interesting. Affirmation theory, not to be confused with affirmative therapy, the subject of another Schreier book, is the brainchild of 2 Dutch Catholic psychiatrists born in the 20th century named Anna True and Conrad Bars. The work of True, which deeply influenced that of Bars, was so impactful that Pope Paul VI called it a gift to the church. I had heard nothing of affirmation theory until a dear colleague named Jeff Mazzone shared it with me. Jeff, whose current project is really to kind of reintroduce this powerhouse duo to the field of Catholic psychology, is currently in the process of republishing a 1971 English translation of a book by True on the emotion of love. The way True and Bars conceived of affirmation is very much in line with attachment theory. Affirmation occurs when one experiences oneself as lovable and inherently good through relationship with others. When this experience is absent or thwarted, one remains unaffirmed, and unaffirmed adults experience themselves as unlovable and have a lot of trouble establishing a rapport with others. So far, this view of the consequences of being unaffirmed, or in Bowlby's language, insecurely attached, are shared between affirmation and attachment theory. The important distinction lies in the overarching anthropological framework of the theories. In addition to their work on affirmation, Theroux and Bars pioneered an approach to repression they called a psychology of normal man, rooted in the authentic Christian anthropology of Thomas Aquinas. This was to be distinguished from the prevailing psychodynamic theory of the time, which they saw grounded almost exclusively in abnormal psychology, in other words, in where man goes wrong. Again, we're faced with the question of how can we guide our clients effectively toward healing and flourishing, or even toward normalcy, if we don't have a sound understanding of what normal is? And how can we discern normal from abnormal human behavior if we lack a true and robust account of who and what human beings are? For Aquinas, there was a natural ordering of the human psyche, which is normal and healthy. He wrote, "It is the nature of the passions to obey reason." In other words, it's good and natural of us to stop and reflect on our emotions, not simply just to act on them or even to express them without reasonable discernment. In the Thomistic framework, human emotions are morally neutral. It's good to engage them and feel them and accept them. But in a healthy and emotionally mature person, the emotions are given moral weight only when guided by the spiritual faculties of the reason and the will. For the Christian, there's also access to the supernatural realm of grace. These are the hallmarks of emotional maturity. Among other benefits, the placement of emotion within the wider context of the spiritual life acts as a safeguard against reductive theories like that of Carl Rogers, which put emotion at the center of moral valuation. For Theroux and Bars, then, emotions become fully human only when they're assumed into and permeated by man's spiritual faculties. In this way, much of their writing on the subject of what love is dovetails really beautifully with the work of John Paul II. They wrote of self-restraining love as the purest form of love. In marriage, Theroux believed, it is the tolerance for the defects of one's spouse that is the most incontestable proof of love's genuineness. Tolerance for the defects of one's spouse is the most incontestable proof of love's genuineness. What a contrast to Rogers' unstated but pretty undeniable bottom line, which is that marriage is desirable only for so long as one spouse finds the other tolerable. And this might be a pretty good assessment of the current culture's view of marriage, too. So to conclude, the culture at large, the mental health industry, and the field of marriage therapy in particular are in desperate need of a robust and true account of who we are as men and women, and of what marriage is, too. You may be sure of one thing. In every therapy room, in every corner of the globe, a worldview is present and active, whether it's acknowledged or not. Thank you.